Hello and welcome to another video where I'm going to review this Kolink Bastion case as well as build a PC in it with a cheap Sketcy BGA to LGA Xeon 5th generation Intel CPU. My first impression of this case is the airflow. It seems to have the rear and top exhausts, but it doesn't really seem to have any proper air intake. Like most modern cases, it has the front entirely blocked off, so cooling on airflow is probably gonna be not the best, but it will be enough for most builds. The tempered glass side panel opens with two thumb screws and it is hinged, so it's easy to open and close. It lifts up from the hinges, so be careful not to let it fall and break it. Behind the other side panel, the case has this one SSD or 2.5-inch drive mount. It also has two of 2.5-inch drive mounts on the other side that will be visible through the glass. For other storage, it has these two trays for 3.5 or 2.5-inch drives. It comes also with some zip ties and rubber covers for the USB ports on the top, which I haven't seen before. I think they're just dust covers or something. And it also has two PCIe slot covers, because the ones in place by default are break-offs that you can not put back if you take them out. It also comes with a speaker and some radiator mounting screws, I think. I don't know if there's really any sense with these IO port covers, but Kolink saw the need to include them with this case. Apparently, you'll probably lose them pretty quickly. After a brief overview of the case, it's time to move on to the hardware that I'll be mounting in the case. And the first thing I'm installing is the Sketcy Turbo Broadwell Xeon, which has been adapted from a BGA soldered to a LGA socketed CPU. If you'd like to know more about this CPU or similar Sketcy BGA to LGA CPUs, I have a playlist where I have many videos reviewing and benchmarking many of these CPUs. Although I saw in an earlier video that this CPU runs very cool and seems very power efficient, and it doesn't need this kind of big cooler, I decided to install this cooler anyway, since I wanted to see if this CPU can be overclocked, which I didn't get to in the last benchmark video. After I had mounted the motherboard inside the case, I moved on to mount the PSU, which will be this 500 watt Chief Tech used PSU, which doesn't really seem the best quality PSU, but I'll be only installing an RX480 in this PC, so it'll be fine. After removing these break-off PCIe slot covers, it will be possible to install the GPU, which will be a Sapphire RX480 4GB version that I think will be a good match for this Sketcy Xeon. The 24-pin ATX connector and the CPU power connector with this PSU are pretty short, and you might need to get extenders for some power supplies with this case. The RGB buttons cable was already connected to the wire coming out of the RGB fan, and the RGB fan seems like it works also as the RGB controller, as the light bar that is on the bottom of the case also connects to the RGB fan with a standard 3-pin RGB connector. For storage, I will be installing a 250GB Crucial SSD and a 500GB Western Digital HDD. The SATA power connector wires on my power supply were quite short, and I needed to install the SSD on the lower SSD mount. After mounting the SSD into the drive mount and installing the power and data SATA cables, I noticed that this case has this wire, which I think is a grounding wire, in the way of the SSD mount. I moved that wire onto the back side so that the wire will not be visible from the front, making it look a bit cleaner. With this wire and also all the other screws in this case, I recommend to be very careful, because the threads can easily be destroyed, like with all of these cheaper cases. It looks like the case has a radiator mount at the bottom, but it would be stupid to mount a radiator there, since it couldn't get any air from anywhere. One thing I tried to do to help the less than ideal airflow situation in this case was to mount the RGB fan included as an top exhaust and swap the CPU fan as a rear intake fan. The GPU will still not be getting fresh air from anywhere, but at least there's an intake and an exhaust fan now. In my opinion, all cases should have at least one fan mount below the GPU to allow it to get fresh air, but usually the modern cases like this one really don't have that, as looks are prioritized and the front panels usually are completely blocked off instead of meshes with fans. After mounting the side panel back on the case and peeling off the protective film, it was time to power the PC on, and this is how the LEDs look like when the PC is on. The RGB is synchronized between the LED strip at the bottom and the RGB fan, and both can be changed with the RGB button on the front panel. It seems like a pretty typical RGB configuration with some presets how the lights behave that you can cycle between with the button. This PC has 16 GB of DDR3 RAM running at 1600 MHz, dual channel, and other specs you can see here. In the BIOS it didn't really allow me to set any clock speeds higher with the standard CPU clock speed options, but I was able to set higher clock speeds with the host clock speed settings. However, they introduced some instability, like failing to boot randomly, so I set them back and only increased the turbo power limit to 75 watts, which I think made a minor increase in clock speeds. One problem this Sketcy CPU has was occasional sluggishness which was fixed by installing all the available updates from Windows Update. The maximum power consumption I got this PC to draw from the wall was 333 watts, which means this PSU will be entirely fine with this hardware. In Apex Legends 1080p mix of low and medium graphics settings got this PC somewhere about 70 to 120 FPS depending on the situation. Sometimes the FPS could plunge to the 50s for a short while, but for the most part the game stayed above 85 FPS and was very playable. As you can see, the CPU stays very cool with the oversized cooler and doesn't go above 2.7 GHz. Somebody more experienced with overclocking could find this CPU interesting to overclock, but I don't have very much experience with overclocking. And I was fine with its performance with these clock speeds. Maybe increasing the turbo power limit further could also help a bit, but I didn't want to experiment too much since I need this PC to work. It will be a daily driver PC for someone. Cyberpunk 2077 with low settings 1080p did run okay, not amazing, but it was entirely playable. It was somewhere from 45 to 65 FPS depending on the situation. I know there's a lot of performance improvement mods for Cyberpunk, but these benchmarks were run without any such mods or patches. Fortnite, being a less demanding game, did run great with 1080p and low settings. It got anywhere from 90 to 120 FPS, so even higher refresh rate screens with esports games wouldn't be entirely wasted with this PC. Kingdom Come Deliverance with 1080p medium settings runs very well at 60 to 70 FPS with the graphics, especially the lighting effects, looking great. Based on my earlier benchmarks with another PCs, this is a bit of a positive surprise how well this game runs at medium.